Hello. So my last video was one in which I was talking about Joe Biden's speech, in which he said that we've been patient, but now we've lost patience and you've got to have the vaccine. And just as a matter of interest, I'd like to know what that we actually meant. Yeah, did it mean his whole government? His medical staff, him and Fauci, for instance? Or was it just himself? You see, perhaps he was using the royal we. For those of you who are not aware of this, it used to be the custom of royalty, both in Britain and, in the rest of Europe, when speaking as the government, to refer to themselves as we rather than I, on the grounds that in the capacity of monarch, they're not one person, but an entire government and indeed an entire country. And I have to tell you that Biden's speech sounded suspiciously like that. However, Biden's mental state is at the moment a side issue. And the first question I have to ask in this video is, why? I asked that in the other one as well. And I asked it from the point of view of someone who has actually had the vaccinations, both of them. You see, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I'm still asking, why do you have to undergo the procedure if you don't want it? You see, so I suppose the rationale is if you get COVID, you're going to be passing it on to other people who might get very sick. They might even die. And of course, that would be irresponsible. Now, if having the vaccination completely stopped you from getting an illness or from passing it on to others, then there'd be an ironclad logic to that argument, wouldn't there? But as it so happens, all the vaccination does, we are now told, is it offers you personally, the receiver of the vaccine, a good chance that you'll get the illness, but with very mild and relatively short-lived symptoms. So you don't end up hospitalized or with lung damage, which is all good in my book, but it doesn't stop you from passing the illness on. And by the way, if you do have very mild symptoms because you've been vaccinated, or indeed if you're completely asymptomatic, then you're more likely to pass it on to other people, aren't you? Because you're not aware you're infectious. No, but that's a digression. What I'm saying is that the vaccination protects you, the vaccinee, if that's a word, but it doesn't protect anyone else. I stress I'm not anti-vax, but I can see no reason to compel others to follow my example. I'd encourage others to do it, especially if they're in the older category, but that's a different matter. So let's get back to President Biden. In his proposed mandate, what he'd be doing is legislating to stop people who would otherwise not be vaccinated from becoming seriously ill or dying from COVID-19, which I have to emphasize is their right. You know, if you want to run the risk of getting COVID-19, and if you do get COVID-19, that is your right. Or at least it should be. Now, let's take a look at a leaflet put out by our local Liberal Democrat Party in North London. You see this leaflet, I'll put it up here. It has a strange sort of similarity to the Biden speech, which is why I'm bringing the two together. That is, when Biden was talking about people having the vaccination and his patience running out, he was making assumptions not only about his own power to order people around and about the nature of government indeed altogether, but he was also making scientifically illiterate assumptions about the way the COVID vaccines work and indeed about the mutating nature of the virus itself. And this leaflet shows similar dismissive assumptions about the power of the local party and the efficacy of the vaccine. It starts like this. Worrying reports of anti-vaccination propaganda being handed out to children outside schools by a group calling themselves Safer to Wait. Note the loaded language. The words safer to wait implies to me that the idea that some people are genuinely worried about vaccinations for children and think that perhaps such treatment should not be accepted without consideration, at least, as am I want to tell you. To my mind, it's a reasonable position to take. Yet this Lib Dem team referred to it as anti-vaccination propaganda. And here is this anti-vaccination propaganda. It points out that the vaccination is to a degree experimental, which it is, and more importantly, that children are mostly unaffected by COVID-19, which they are. So there appears not to be a pressing urge, well, not to my mind anyway, a pressing urge to use it on children. And the leaflet ends with the observation that since the chance of harm to children from COVID-19 is low, why take the risks of having the shot? As I say, I agree with them, and I emphasize, I believe that this vaccination is one of the shining achievements of modern medicine, but for adults who can make their own decisions. And my decision was that on balance, someone like me was going to fare a lot worse if I actually got COVID-19 than if I had the vaccination. For children, from everything I've read, it's precisely the other way round. This is not propaganda. This is a leaflet giving a point of view that does not accord with the Liberal Democrats' ideas. That's all. The Lib Dem leaflet goes on to say, scientific evidence shows that vaccinations are the best way for us to protect against COVID-19. They are confirmed to reduce the risk of serious illness and death among all age groups. This is not true. In fact, scientific evidence shows quite the opposite. The vaccine certainly has not been used on the mass of children, so there is no evidence whatsoever to support the claim that it is efficacious across all age groups. It then continues, if you see anti-vaccination leafleters targeting schools, we encourage you to contact your counsellors, providing the date, time and location. In fact, what they're doing is whipping up an idea of attack in a way, aren't they? Whatever they're saying here. So we can raise this with the relevant local authorities. The party has nothing to do with this. And what they're saying to people here is report it to us, a political party, and then we can report it to the authorities. Because people can't report it themselves, but there isn't anyone to report it to, because there is absolutely nothing wrong with somebody handing out a leaflet like this. Do you see? They're trying to make this into some sort of a demonstration, mob mentality type of thing. I'm going to get onto that in a minute. There have been worrying reports of some posters having razors hidden behind them. So we would ask people to take extra care before removing anything. That's such nonsense. If anyone wanted to convince people not to have a vaccination, handing them a leaflet with a razor in it, it just makes no sense. But it does add a feeling of danger to the idea. And this is a local political party putting this stuff out. It's disgraceful. It's nothing more than an attempt to whip up hysteria. And my theory is that they're doing this because when in a hysteria, people can't think clearly. I'm getting there because I'm going to be talking about that. Meanwhile, since it's been proved that whatever the variant, children don't get this illness in any significantly dangerous way, why the push to vaccinate? Here in the UK, there's this big push for vaccinating children, and over in the USA, there's this governmental push to vaccinate the whole population and penalise people who aren't vaccinated or who give jobs to people who aren't vaccinated. I don't think, by the way, that the Lib Dems are in the pay of Big Pharma. They're too much like sandalled students there. I know that lot. I don't think that they are in some sort of conspiracy either. They're not even intelligent enough for that. And they're certainly not working for the insertion of computer chips into kids to get them to vote Lib Dem in 10 years' time. No, this is a different situation. It's a training exercise. And it's not one they're planning either. It's part of a general virus of the mind, which is abroad at the moment, and it's in the minds of politicians. And this is what is propelling them all in this direction. I have previously pointed out the similarity between training people and training horses. But first, I want to remind you, I'm going to now talk about how people act in a crowd. There's a writer called Gustave Le Bon. I think he must have been the very first social psychologist, and he was working at the mid-19th century. At the end of the 19th century, he published a book called The Crowd. And in it, he made the observation, which was startling at the time, that the mentality of the crowd always descended to the level of its lowest common denominator. That is, a professor of philosophy who might be the world's deepest thinker, if caught up in a crowd, ends up with about the same mental capacity as a street sweeper, or even lower. This is because the crowd is a unit on its own. It is easily swayed by emotion and the ethics of the moment. So while each human being in that crowd may, in ordinary life, have enough individual intelligence to weigh up arguments and make rational decisions, once that person is in a crowd or a mob, that individual intelligence isn't there anymore. It's replaced by mob intelligence, which is not intelligence at all. In fact, and these are my words, not his, a mob as a unit has about the same amount of intelligence as a horse, and is about as easily excited, frightened, or led, and by the same basic rules. You can't argue logic to a mob, but you can excite a mob into violence, lynchings, and acts of great foolhardiness if you know how to do it. So I just want to get back to the horse to make my point. I've told you that horses discipline each other by biting and kicking. So a human being who wants to ride a horse and establish primacy has to replicate that when training. I'm not talking about beating a horse to death before some idiot says that's what I'm saying, but a quick flip with a whip is sometimes necessary if the horse has decided it wants to make its own decisions. I'll give you an example. My horse was brought up in remote countryside, in Spain actually. When that horse was learning to walk along London roads, there was much to worry it. And at one point we came across a road crossing that it was painted with that sort of cross-hatching marking. Now, horses don't have such good depth perception because their eyes are on the outside of their heads. They can't actually see bifocally that well. They can, but they have to move their heads from side to side to do it. Okay, so when my horse saw those painted lines, he went crazy because he couldn't see what those lines were. I'm assuming he thought that they were a sort of net suspended above a hole. Anyway, he was terrified of crossing them and he flat out refused. He was dancing about and going sideways and jumping around and all sorts of stuff like that. Now, there's no amount of logical argument you can use on a horse in a situation like that. All the love and gentle cajoling in the world wouldn't help. And in any case, we were in traffic. I had to do something. I pulled him straight and I gave him a couple of flicks with the whip, and finally he went forward, not because he saw any logic in my argument, but because I had established I was the herd leader and he was supposed to do what I told him. After that, each time we crossed such a set of markings, it was easier, until after 2 or 3 instances he just walked across the crossing without any trouble. Perhaps a couple of times I had to hold the whip out just to remind him, out to the side where he could see it with his, because horses can see round the back as well. And that's how you train horses. And I'm sorry to have to say this, but that's how you train human crowds as well, because people in mobs or crowds have just about the same ability for calm, rational thought as has a horse, and that is not very much. Horses don't intellectualize, and neither does a crowd. So if you convince people to do what they don't want to do, you've made them into something you don't need to be so sharp about next time. And that's why I'm talking about Biden. Certainly, this infection has given governments the opportunity to think of themselves as gods saving our lives by controlling us. And it may be for the best of motives, but it is certainly up to us to remind them that these governments are also crowds, and they are also subject to the natural law that when people are in crowds, they don't think too clearly. Of course, in the case of Biden, if you want my personal opinion, he has about the same intelligence as a horse, all by himself. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Granbo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.